So I say all that to say I just want to give us some taste for how much I love CT. I think it's an exciting subject, and you'll be hearing all sorts about it, but we're just going to get the briefest kind of covering of CT today as we talk about simulator design, because it has absolutely revolutionized the way that we do simulation in radiation therapy. It's changed the whole game, right? So y'all are coming into a moment where pretty much it's just ubiquitous. Like, you're not seeing any of the older simulation styles or anything like that. So I probably won't address those very much. They were very useful, and some of that knowledge can be helpful. So if you find an older radiation therapist who's interested in telling you some about how simulation used to be done, great. I don't want to communicate too much of that to y'all here because I don't want to confuse folks. But before we jump into this, primarily my big drive for today is just to get us comfortable with some of the terminology as well as some of the actual techniques for using CT. Okay, so that's my big importance thing today. So I'll be stressing terminology. And before we really jump into talking about CT simulator design, there's three things that we need to just kind of have shared understanding of. Are we all familiar? I'm just asking, are we all familiar with the terms coronal, sagittal, axial? Okay, great. Good. All right, so here's our objectives for moving forward from there. We're going to describe the components of the computed tomography. I'll call it CT, right? And to that point, we'll also use some common acronyms for SIM, right? So hopefully everyone, I don't have to say simulation every now, or computed tomography. I'm going to be using a lot of acronyms for junk, but I'm not. If I start using acronyms that you're not familiar with, please stop me, because that's not my intention. I'm not trying to talk over y'all's head or anything. I just am so common. These acronyms have become so common with me that I want to make sure that they're familiar terms now. We'll talk about the steps of the SIM process, right? And explain and apply Hounsfield units. I will actually call those Hounsfield units because, I don't know, HU just seems like it sounds longer to take. Also, Hounsfield is, of course, the guy who was the amazing, crazy person who stuck the X-ray tube on the turntable, right? That's why he's got the units named after him. And we'll talk a little bit about him. And then we'll state types and appearances of artifacts that can result from sticking X-ray tubes on turntables. And then we'll look at all the key terms from our textbook. So that's really what we're about today. One thing I want to point out, and we'll get into this deeper, but when we look at these objectives, right, and this is really significant to any time we're talking about computers, right, anytime we're talking about these guys, the way that computers work, largely, if we generalize it to like the nth degree, is algorithms. Right? Algorithms. Has anyone ever heard that term before? Yes, good. And y'all are all familiar with algorithms because algorithms are pretty much, for example, like following a recipe. Like if I wanted to bake a cake, I would have a series of steps that I would go through, and I would need to follow those steps in a certain order, and then they would come to an end. Right? But I want to just point out, when in looking at objectives here, right? These objectives are also an algorithm, right? We have a series of objectives that we're going to talk about, and then we will come to an end. So they drive pretty much everything we do in terms of computers. So here is the X-ray tube that we're going to hook up to a turntable, right? And y'all are covering this quite a bit in your physics class, so I'm not going to belabor it too much, but it is a really helpful thing to be familiar with, and we can have kind of a show and tell with the X-ray tube here, so you can have an opportunity to look at all the inner working parts of it. But I like these kind of simplified diagrams too. And the big thing here that I want us to take away from it is we've got a positive side and a negative side. And the positive side is called what? Good. And we've got a negative side that's called our cathode, right? So here is our anode side over here. I've circled the positive side, and the negative side is on the right side of the screen. And both of them are made out of tungsten, right? For the most part in CT tubes. Nothing's really changed with that. Every now and then we make them out of gold, but for the most part they're made out of tungsten because tungsten has a high atomic number, but it also it can cool very rapidly, and it can take a whole lot of heat, right? So it's like when God was inventing elements, he came up with tungsten so that these gorillas could, make X-ray tubes out of them because it's perfect for that. The big thing that happens in terms of the production of the X-ray beam, and I think y'all are talking about this right now in physics, so I won't belabor it too much, but what is the primary way that X-rays are produced? So we said we're going to bombard this anode with electrons. We're going to hit those two rocks together, right? And it's going to crap out a bunch of X-rays, right? And we think that's awesome. We're monkeys and we think that's awesome. What's the primary way that it gets those X-rays out? What's the number one interaction that occurs that produces the diagnostic X-rays?
Is it annihilation?
It is not. It's, keep guessing though.
Is it excitation?
It is a form of excitation, but specifically bremsstrahlung. It is a brems. Have y'all talked about brems yet? Okay, good, good. I knew, every now and then it's good to figure out where the overlap's occurring, right? Pay really close attention in your physics class when they start talking about brems, because brems is everything, pretty much everything that we do in the diagnostic range is probably the bremsstrahlung interaction. It's a fancy German word that just means stopping. But of course in German, it's got to sound like someone died, So bremsstrahlung interactions means stopping, and what happens is we knock these rocks together, we take an electron, we slam it into that tungsten anode, and as the electrons stop, they produce X-rays. Because energy can be neither created nor destroyed, it just has to be continuous, it changes forms. So in the stopping of that produces an X-ray. And it can be a wide spectrum of X-rays. If we were actually able to turn on that X-ray tube and see the X-rays that it's producing, guess what? We would probably all be unicorns, number one. But number two, it would be shooting out a bunch of rainbows, right? Because it's making a spectrum of energies. It's making a whole huge spectrum of energies over our unicorn population, right? That's a colorful metaphor that I like to think about a lot. All right, the other thing I want to point out about what happens inside the tube that's significant to us in X-ray is I pointed out that it's really, really heavy. The reason that it's really, really heavy is because it's encased in lead. The reason that it's encased in lead is because when we produce these X-rays, they are produced, and here's another fancy word, isotropically. Right? Let me spell out these words because I'm not trying to lose y'all as I'm talking about this.
I'm thinking, Betty, we need a taller desk for you.
I know, right?
That's going to kill you by the end of the day.
So, what I'm talking about as we make these X-rays, right, is two processes. One of them we're going to call Brem, and I think it has two S's or something crazy. I don't remember. It's German. Bremsstrahlung. I'm going to run out of space trying to write it. Bremsstrahlung is stopping X-ray production. The electrons are stopped, and they produced an X-ray. It only happens in the tube. It is an interaction between an electron and the anode. It only happens in the tube. You'll probably be receiving a question about that at some point. The other big fancy word that we talked about here is isotropic. Have y'all got your notes on Brems? Okay. Isotropic means it happens in all directions. Like we have isocenter, right, within the patient. Iso is like a center. I think it means center. I don't remember. Iso, what does iso mean? I don't know. Sorry, I can't remember. Equal center. Okay. So isotropic, I guess tropic like in all directions, equally in all directions. Isotropic, equally in all directions. Sorry, my internal Latin dictionary just ran off. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the history. So all that Beatlemania stuff, right? The reason it's significant is it created millions of dollars. All those screaming teenagers, bought a whole bunch of limousines for a bunch of fat guys who sit around smoking cigars all day, right? And those fat guys also were like, we want to have more limousines and more cigars. So they're like, what do? We research and develop other junk. So what's some other junk we could do, right? And this is around 1972, which is like the era of figuring out what's other junk we can do. I like the 70s. But around 1972, interesting fellow named Geoffrey Hounsfield, who was from Nottinghamshire, right, in Great Britain, from Robin Hood's backyard. He liked to walk around in the woods and think about Robin Hood all day long. He was out walking in the woods one day, and he asked that age-old question, what happens if you put an X-ray tube on a turntable? And he went back and found one of those fat cats with lots of money from all those Beatles record sales, and he says, let's do it, right? So what did they do? They went around London to all the kosher slaughterhouses, and they got cow brains. This right here is a cow brain. And they went to the kosher slaughterhouses because they use kosher slaughter methods where the brains are left intact, because you don't want those in your hot dogs if you're eating kosher. We're okay with having them in our hot dogs. In the place of the turntable, he used a lathe, right? And so this is just a thing that turns things around, right? And so we can see the mechanisms that are turning things around down in here and stuff, right? But it's turning this cow brain around in this direction, right? It's going to just rotate that cow brain around. And he didn't actually use X-rays for the first radiation source. He used americanium, which is a radioactive element, right? He used a radioactive element, americanium. And then, but he did have a way of detecting it. And so here's that detector over here. And it literally was just detecting one thing at a time. So it's not a very efficient process. But what was significant about this is not this weird, terrifying looking machine, right? But what's interesting about this is what he did with what we will call the raw data, right? So let's get over here and talk about this stuff. So next term to probably write down on your slides is raw data. Raw data. And raw data is all of the thousands, maybe millions, maybe trillions of bits, right, that are produced when we take a cow brain and put it on a turntable and turn it around with a radioactive source and a detector, right? That's the raw data. It's just the junk, the weird looking stuff that comes out of that. So here's a great example of some raw data right here. We will call this a one projection, right? So this is just the cow brain, or in this case it looks like a bunch of circles and crap, but this is some stuff from a single projection. So it's raw data from a single direction. But we're not interested in that. We're interested in turning this stuff around, right? So we're going to keep turning it. And for example, here's 4 projections, right? So now we've shot the brain from 4 different directions, right? Now here's 8, right? Still pretty useless to me, but what we're doing now is we're back projecting it. We're not just interested in this one projection, or any one of these 4 projections, right? Or any one of these 8 projections. We're combining them all. We're yet letting the computer, an algorithm, combine them all. It's using a recipe to combine them all. It's using a recipe to just combine them all. So it does that over and over and over and over again. And the process that we call that, the fancy word for that, is filtered back projection. Filtered back projection. There's a number of different ways it could do that, but the generalized way that we think about things is this is an iterative process. And this is what computers are amazing at, right? Computers are amazing at doing things over and over and over again. Like, who here has played Minecraft? Has anyone played Minecraft? It's an amazing game, and it's worth just downloading it to your iPad and hitting start. Because what it's doing at that point is an iterative process where it creates a new world every single time you hit start. And this world is massive. Massive. So every single time, though, if you can imagine, every single time it initiates an algorithm that's a repetitive process of just generating a world, which I think is pretty cool. In the CT scanner, it's going to do a repetitive process over and over and over again, and of iteratively, or we'll call it filtered back projecting the data until it has like 60 back projected profiles. And it can combine all those, and now we have what was inside of that cow's brain. At least a single axial slice of it. Okay? So now we are going to call it, before we called this stuff up here, what did we call this? The raw data, right? Now we're going to call this down here our image data. It is image data. So we took that raw data, we crunched all those numbers, and now we have something worth looking at, right? Now we have something worth looking at. And one thing to kind of stress with image data is that the process of moving, so I mentioned that the process of moving from raw data to image data is an iterative process, that's a repetitive process. One of the things it's trying to do is interpolate. This is another $5 word, interpolate. I'll write it down. Interpolate. And I'm sorry, I know I write like a 5-year-old with this thing, but it's just clunky. I don't have the newest, fanciest MacBook, so I can't be cool like everyone in California. But interpolate's just a method of creating missing data using math. So we're going to math the data into place. The stuff that's not there, we'll figure out by math.
And this is what the image data is doing?
This is what the computer's doing with that raw data. It's interpolating.
Okay.
And we'll go a little bit more in depth on interpolate in a second, but I wanted to go ahead and introduce that term. The other thing that's interesting about this is this. So we've mentioned that the image data now accurately spatially represents what's going on inside the cow's brain, right? It now accurately spatially represents the little squares and circles the cow is thinking about, right? Or really just the anatomy of the cow. It doesn't actually see what the cow's thinking, but the anatomy, right? The thing that's interesting too is so it does this pixel by pixel, right? And we'll define pixel here in a sec, but it assigns them an attenuation profile. So it says that this stuff that's black has a different density than the stuff that's white. It has a different density. So it's embedded in the image. It's not just the spatial representation of where junk is. There's also a ton of information about what the density of that thing is, right? And so we will call that an attenuation profile. And we'll unpack that term quite a bit more. So just kind of put that off to the side, that through this process of creating image data, we've got both spatial representation as well as attenuation profiles. I think that's cool. And I also think this thing is cool because it looks like the Terminator. This is a CT gantry without the protective coating about, and bear in mind this thing is spinning really fast, right? Like I don't know precisely how fast this machine turns, and we have an indicator to tell us which direction our crazy turntable is going to be turning, right? But it could be like upwards of, I don't know, like 300, 400, 500 times a minute it's spinning. So it's spinning very, very quickly. This is nothing I don't know if you ever get a chance, if they're ever doing diagnostics on the CT and they take the gantry cover off and they do the spin test, watch it. It is amazing. I could show you, there's YouTube videos, maybe we'll watch them in a little bit, of some of the newer CT scans doing the spin test without the gantry. It looks like it could just pulverize you if you got too close to it, like it would just suck you in and pulverize you. Very, very powerful. And this is literally what we're feeding our patients through. And the only thing that's separating them is like some flimsy material like this, something thinner than your desktop, basically, because we don't want a lot of stuff to get in the way of the x-rays. But I like this schematic because it's showing me a number of things. I have, if you look here, I have a T right here. This is our x-ray tube. This is where we've embedded our x-ray tube. And it actually literally is just that x-ray tube stuck into the side of this thing, right? Over here I have a D, and this is indicating a detector array, right? This is a fairly recent scanner, and it has an array of detectors, right? And then over here we have this X, which indicates the isocenter for this aperture here, right? This gantry aperture. So the whole big thing is going to be called a gantry, right? The whole big thing is called a gantry. This area inside the donut hole is the gantry aperture. The center point there is isocenter for the CT machine. And it's a very important point for the CT machine. And what it does with the information centers on that point. I can't stress that enough. Not enough technologists understand how important that imaginary point is. So that is our isocenter for the gantry. So we indicated that there's a tube There's also a generator, a high voltage generator, and I'm not exactly certain, but I think it's some of this junk down in here is high voltage generators. So in addition to something that could shred you, you have something that could electrify you to death spinning around the patient, plus something that could irradiate you and make you sterile. So it's really an exciting advent in history when we came up with this amazing new way to bang rocks together. But it definitely seems pretty intense to me. So along this imaginary point that's the isocenter, if I were to stick somehow my pencil or whatever through this screen, and if you can imagine a line coming out from this X and hitting you in the forehead, right? That is the Z-axis. That's the Z-axis of the CT scanner. I know for therapy, Z-axes can differ, but for in the CT world, that is Z. It will always be Z. Thank God. Related to that, of course, we also have a Y-axis that I'll draw through isocenter, and we have an X-axis. So the Z-axis we're going to have to imagine, right? But we also have a Y-axis and an X-axis, and they're pretty much where we would expect them to be. Okay, let's talk a little bit about this crazy looking thing, because this is another way of thinking about the raw data. This crazy smoke trail thing. This is what we're going to call a sinogram. Sinogram, S-I-N-O gram. These pictures may look a little familiar to us down here, right? Because here we have that projection process being interpreted again, right? If we've got some junk inside of something, some kind of iterative process is occurring. And I'll tell you what's basically happening. We have all these different attenuation profiles in the sinogram, and it's like it's got these data, right? Like a slinky of data from spinning a tube around a cow brain and sampling it, and it's going to somehow combine it into where I can see what's inside of that, right? So this sinogram is just a fancier way of looking at the raw data. Okay, here's another way to think about the raw data, because I talked about how in the world of the CT computer, the sinogram is going to give us spatially represented stuff, like it gives us a way to talk about spatial representation. If we talk about kernels or K-space, now we're talking about Fourier transfers, right? I'm not trying to talk over your head. This is kind of computery stuff that we'll dig into more deeply next trimester when we do the CT class. But I want you just to be familiar with this, because you do this every day probably on your cellular phone if you do Twitter or ever edit a photo with your Photos app. Anytime you change the contrast or the color of an image, you're manipulating this junk right here, which we're going to call K-space, right? So if I were to manipulate things here, if I were to start drawing lines in here, it would change the color and contrast of this image over here, right? I don't want us to get too in-depth into that, but I just want you to know that embedded in all of this information and all this raw data, there's also these attenuation profiles that we can manipulate. We can change those, just like you change the color of an image on your phone. It's the exact same process. Okay, so that was the software side. Let me see. That was gantry stuff that we just talked about. Let's drill down a little bit more into the hardware, and then we'll jump back and talk just very briefly about software stuff. So I mentioned that there's a recipe that the CT thing is going to follow, right? So let's look at this recipe first. We've got an X-ray tube, some kind of way of filtering it, right? We've got some collimators between the X-ray tube and the patient. And then we have a fan beam of X-rays so that slices through the patient. We said this point kind of at the middle of the patient, hopefully, is going to be called what? Isocenter, good. And then as we scroll down, we've also got a detector array. So nothing new there, right? That produces an electrical signal that's then fed into an ADC, right? And that's just an analog to digital converter. An ADC is an analog to digital converter. It takes an electric signal, an analog signal, and converts it to digital. analog to digital converter. So it goes in electric, comes out digital, and then the computer crunches all those numbers. Okay? That's all we're talking about, right? That's what the hardware is. So let's look a little bit more in depth at this illustration. I actually have a larger copy of this for you. We'll probably come back to this next trimester, but here's a blank version of this, and we're going to spend some time just filling this in because hopefully it'll be helpful to us to orient ourselves a little bit to the machine and its layout. Now I get my cheat sheet so I don't lose myself along the way here. So I've zoomed in kind of on this image, right? And the 46, right? We see a little arrow pointing to 46. Let's start there, right? So I'm going to zoom in quite a bit on 46. Little boxes, 46. And this is just our table. Okay? And so 46 is got some stuff that it's hooked up to right next to it. Whoa, stay. You're not going to stay, are you? Well, that stinks. I'm sorry, Julie. She's like, oh, I'm going to puke. All right, yeah, don't look. So right next to it, this is my first time actually doing this, so this is the new way of monkeys banging rocks together. Table motor control. Motor control is right next to it. And that's 44. Okay. And then those are wired back to this big box here. 36 is our computer. I'm just going to put comp because we are making computed tomography. So the biggest part of this is a computer, right? Everything feeds back into the computer. It's almost rocket science, but not quite, because there's just the computer does all the rocket science for us. So the computer also has, below the table motor control, is an X-ray control, right? So this box 28 is X-ray control. Because we want something to control this thing. Like, I don't want to be out there controlling it, right? That would be a disaster. So 28 is going to be our X-ray controller. And right below it, I said I couldn't quite say where this thing was inside the gantry, but we've indicated there's going to be a high voltage thing, high voltage generator. Right, kind of hooked up to that X-ray controller, right? Okay. And I want to stress to y'all, because I tell this to my X-ray tech students all the time, I don't expect you to be electrical engineers and to like be able to like build me a CT scanner out of like some gum wrappers and like stuff that you found in the classroom. That would be awesome if you did. Like, that'd be a great birthday present. But what I'm really interested in is can you work through the system? Can you think through the organization of this machine, right, that you work with every day? Not take the machine for granted. Give it a sweet name like Becky or Sue or something, because I've named all of my CT scanners I've ever worked with, and they've loved me for it. They do have personalities. When you have a system that's this complex, has anyone ever heard of the term ghost in the machine? I'm a firm believer that there is a ghost in the machine. These things, when we have iterative processes and thinking like structures occurring for long enough, they develop their own personalities. And so treat it as a semi-sentient being. Like, treat it like you would treat your cat.
I have a comment. Dave
Yeah.
lately names all his computers.
Certainly.
And, what is the thing for the internet? What do you call that?
Like the router and
The router?
Yeah.
They have names too.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, it's join a long-standing tradition of I think about that moment. I'll pause this. So we have a gantry motor control, right? Gantry motor control. And so the importance here is, like, now we have a way to move people in and out of this thing. We have a way to turn the X-ray machine on and off, and we have a way to turn the thing that spins it around on and off. All of those seem very important to me. Because if I can't move people in and out, People freak out, guess right. If you can't get a person out of this machine, they don't like sitting there. All right. So we've pretty much talked about all the hardware, but we're going to start to kind of segue a little bit towards the software stuff. And down here below the computer, we have this image reconstructor. Image reconstructor, I can't spell. Constructor. Or write. I write like a 5-year-old. So, and then the other stuff kind of off to the side, like 40 is just the operator console. It kind of is like that seems like the no-brainer to me that I have to have like a keyboard or some way to do things with this computer, or it's stupid, but you need to indicate there's an operator console. And then the other thing that seems like a no-brainer, there needs to be mass storage. So 38 is mass storage, and we're talking about mass storage, right? Like if on a hot summer day, I probably already shared this with y'all, I love to hang out in the PAX closet, right? Because it is like 30 degrees in there, because it has mass storage of all my CT data, and it's super, super cold. Right? And that's the way computers work. And that's why, one of the reasons I love computers. Okay, so now that we've kind of addressed all these kind of major components of hardware, let's talk a little bit about the software, right? And the big thing here is we've talked about there's different kinds of data, right? So this form up here, I'm going to ask you to know that this is called axial. And then I want you to draw the no smoking sign around it, right? Like, we all know this is like the international sign of like Ghostbusters or whatever. Because as radiation therapists, we are never, ever, 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 ever going to use axial scan modes for CT scanning. It's completely useless to us. We'll talk about why that is in more depth in the CT class. But largely, what we've got in an axial data set is this scanner. So here's our z-axis running through this axial data set, right? Here's our z-axis. And the scan, sometimes this is called step and shoot scanning. So it move the table, scan the patient. Move the table, scan the patient. Move the table, scan the patient, right? And what that results in is each one of these little slices here is a discrete data set, completely unrelated to the data set before it or the data set before that. The problem with that from a radiation therapist standpoint is, if you can imagine, there's no way that I could ever treat a cancer like if I'm just going to have like little tiny slices, like, you know what I mean? Like slice through the prostate, right? Little tiny slices, and I've got to make a treatment plan for this slice, and then it's unrelated to the slice below it, and you know what I mean? Like, you'll drive your dosimetrist crazy. I just know it because I'm speaking from experience. What we are interested in is this kind of data set down here, and we're going to call this helical. And now it looks kind of like that slinky I had earlier, right? Now, what's so great about helical? This is a volumetric data set. Okay, so it's acquired at a slight angle. We can see it has a little bit of an angle to things. But it is able to interpolate really accurately. So think about it like this. I've got that slinky again. And in this case, what I'm doing is I am moving the table and scanning the patient at the same time. None of that move the table, scan the patient, move the table. I'm just move and scan. Get them through. And so I get this slinky-like spiral of information, right? But when I compress that down in my computer, now I've got like a chunk, like a solid chunk of the patient's body, and I have spatial information and attenuation profiles for that solid chunk. This is amazing. Like, this is good stuff. And when you see those fancy CT pictures of like hearts and stuff that are 3D rendered, those are all acquired helically because they're trying to get that volumetric data set. It is really kind of gold. Unfortunately, axial is still around for a number of reasons, mostly bogus. So I just want to point out, you will never use it as therapists. And if you see a therapist using it, ask them, what the heck are you doing? Like, do you even know? Like, do you, like, don't even, you know? All right, let's talk about these two bad boys here. These are pixels and voxels, right? A pixel is just a fancy name for a picture element. It's a two-dimensional data square. A two-dimensional data square is a pixel, a picture element. You look at pixels all day, every day. Y'all were pretty much raised by pixels. Voxels are like the bigger, fatter pixel, right? It's a three-dimensional cube of data. So you can see here's my z-axis again, and this is why the z-axis will never change in CT, is because it's tied to this stuff. So again, here's that imaginary line flying out of the screen and hitting you in the forehead, that z-axis, right? And so it's volumetric, this voxel's volumetric because the data is being acquired over a distance along the z-axis. The pixel would just be x and y. The voxel has x, y, and z. And the computer then assigns to each voxel one Hounsfield unit. So one attenuation profile, one Hounsfield unit will be assigned to each pixel or each voxel in our case. Okay. I know we're talking about some pretty crazy stuff, right? Clearly I'm interested in this stuff. I wouldn't expect everyone to be interested in this stuff. Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay, all right. I'm trying to break this down to where it's just the essential stuff that y'all really need to understand what's happening when you walk into a CT simulation, right? Because this is the stuff that the technologists aren't going to tell you. They're going to be like, you put this inside the patient and you do this, right? That's what they're going to tell you because they're good therapists, right? But they're not going to tell you, at first I'm really concerned about the pixels and voxels because if I don't have no one's going to talk about it that way. I wish they did because it would terrify everyone. All right, volume averaging. This occurs when an object straddles these slices, right? So I have this squirrel that I've CT'd or something, I don't know. But I've got in between my slices, and I don't like that because now I said I can only assign one Hounsfield unit to this slice and one Hounsfield unit to that slice. So guess what? I never really got a good measure of the squirrel. I got like half the squirrel in one Hounsfield unit and half the squirrel in another Hounsfield unit. And so I'll call that volume averaging. Volume averaging. This is a significant problem in dosimetry. This is kind of the state of the art. Significant problem in dosimetry. So what we're interested in is how can we get the squirrel in the voxel, right? To where we have a Hounsfield unit that's indicative of the whole squirrel. The big thing that we can do is as we decrease slice thickness, as we make tinier and tinier cuts, we will decrease volume averaging. Right? So think about it like a steak versus like the thinly cut turkey meat from Hillshire Farms or wherever. Right? If we've got the turkey meat, there's less volume averaging. If I've got the steak, I've got all the fat and all the junk and everything between the top and the bottom of the steak. As we decrease the slice thickness, we will decrease volume averaging, but guess what? Patient dose goes up. A ton. Patient dose goes up, and this is a significant issue with CT right now, is this tension of how do we get a good volumetric data set without giving everyone cancer that gets a CT scan. That's really that's a big concern in any time we're treating cancer, right? Is the treatment just going to cause more cancer, cause more problems than, just leaving it alone? Okay, let's talk about some of these goofy acronyms that some of these you've probably already heard. These are largely related to data communication. PACS, right? We should be familiar with that. Picture Archiving Communication System. Picture Archiving Communication System. This is the way we send stuff to mass storage, or from mass storage to, honestly, my cell phone now or laptop or wherever else we send it. It is the system that sends it. And what format does it use? It uses a DICOM format. It uses a DICOM format. So this is the format for sending images, DICOM is. I think it means digital image communication in medicine, or I don't know. Okay, how N became an O, I don't know, but yeah, I think that's right. Is a DICOM, digital communication. The HL7 is another format that's important, and this is largely the format that communicates stuff to the CT scanner. So like for example, patient Smith shows up and the front desk person types in patient Smith, right, and misspells her name. Now the HL7 is going to communicate that to my CT scanner, and I'll be like, oh, okay, great, this is not right. Like that's the HL7 is what communicated from the front desk computer to my CT scanner. So a lot of times it carries patient information from the HIS, right, or the EMR. And more commonly, I hear it called EMR. And are y'all familiar with the EMR that they use at your clinical sites? What EMR are they using?
Are you talking about ARIA?
ARIA.
Medical record
ARIA, yeah. ARIA is y'all's medical record system. And interestingly enough, ARIA is just the tip of the frickin' iceberg on it. Because ARIA is actually more like a RIS. Right? RIS is like radiologic information system. ARIA is a special RIS for therapy because we have some special charting that we need to do in therapy that's different from the charting that we do in x-ray or ultrasound, that's different from the charting that they do as nurses. So they've built different systems for these. So typically the health information system, the HIS, is for the HERS, it's for the nurses. I shouldn't make that joke. The HIS is for the folks who are entering health information stuff like doctor's orders and stuff like that. The RIS is for the x-ray techs, and y'all also are using a RIS when you use ARIA.
Is that AMR?
That's the HIS and RIS, which all feed into the EMR.
I didn't see the RS.
Yeah, sorry. The EMR is the electronic medical record system, and it's the big thing, Epic. Epic's awesome. If you ever hear someone complaining about Epic, just say shut up, because they don't know how bad some of these other EMRs are. Like they've clearly only worked at Baptist, and you know they have no clue how bad some of these EMRs are.
Okay, so ARIA, other people in the hospital can't act.
We are in the midst of birth pains of that information age, right, where we are making a rapid transition into an increased world where we use computers, and there still are those problems. vSIM, I'll use that a lot. Y'all probably have seen a vSIM, a verification SIM. Sometimes they call them virtual SIMs. I typically think of it as a verification SIM. When I think of a vSIM, I'm thinking about, okay, I did my CT scan, and that's great with the patient setup and everything. The dosimetrists did their treatment plan. They sent that over like on ARIA to the radiation therapy machine, and now like during our lunch break or whenever when we've got some downtime on the machine, we're going to set up the patient and take port films and make sure that everything verifies, that everything checks, right down the line. So that's a vSIM. So we'll go back to this real quick, but an algorithm, again, as we've kind of illustrated over in abundance, is a step-by-step recipe of programmable operations executed in a specific order, and we might add to that, it has an end. It ends. It doesn't just keep on doing it. This video to YouTube if need be. So, the Hounsfield units are going to be a way of capturing the attenuation. And when we talk about the attenuation of the X-ray beam, we're talking about the degree to which the X-ray beam is reduced by an object. And so it might be reduced by photoelectric effect. Have y'all talked about photoelectric effect in physics yet? Okay. Okay. You should be driving in that direction. Or it might be reduced by Compton effect. If the X-ray beam interacts with the object and ionizes an atom, it could be reduced, and the reduction by that object is going to be called attenuation. So Hounsfield units are a way for the computer to quantify that attenuation, right? So just as a comparison, compare and contrast, we've got a grayscale here, right? And the grayscale is significant because in this case down here it represents 2,000 Hounsfield units, but they're represented in an interesting way. They've got a 0 in the middle, they've got a negative 1,000 out here on our left, and they've got a positive 1,000 out here on our right. Okay? So if I were going to think through this together, I've said that the grayscale for the computer's thinking is that there's 2,000 Hounsfield units, right? The monitor, your computer monitor, has somewhere around either 256 shades of gray or maybe 512 shades of gray, depending on the kind of monitor it is. But, you know, somewhere in the hundreds of shades of gray. Your eye sees roughly 40 shades of gray. So you could remember that with thinking about 50 shades of gray, I guess. But your eye sees about 40 shades of gray. So computer sees 2,000 shades of gray. Monitor shows 200 shades of gray. Your eye sees 50 shades of gray. Right? That's important because there's that. What that means is that there's information about the attenuation hidden in the images that my eye can't see. There's information that's hidden in the images my eye can't see. So what do we do with that? Well, we're going to play with it some. So out here, we've got black. Black is black, right? And over here, we've got white is white, right? The black stuff on an X-ray. What it shows up black on an X-ray? Air. Thank you. So air. Air in the world of the Hounsfield units is like negative 1,000 Hounsfield units, right? What shows up really white on my bone? Yep, bone. So this is where we got the grayscale from. Specifically, though, Hounsfield was not interested in air and bone initially. He was interested in water. So out here, the 0 for the CT machine is water. The phantoms that we use a lot of times in radiation therapy, also water. Why did he choose water? Well, because it's cheap and plentiful, and he had to do a lot of tests. So he figured, I could either choose this brick of gold I have here, or I could choose water. I think I'll go with the water. So all of the shades of gray between it run those differences between, like for example, air and water, or bone and water, right? So there's not a lot going on the negative side of the Hounsfield units scale. There is one thing that's interesting that's less dense than water, or has a less linear attenuation than water for an interesting reason, and that's lipids, fat. Fat actually shows up as, even though fat, so if I had a chunk of human fat for some reason that I'm walking around with, and I dropped it into a cup of water for some other reason I can't say, it would float, right? And it is one of the few structures in the body that would. So lipid content will show up in a negative range on the Hounsfield unit scale. But everything else in terms of soft tissue is going to show up. So like, for example, we might have brain here. Oh my goodness, I can't spell. We might, very close to it, we might have blood, right? And so if I were to assign Hounsfield numbers to these, fat might be somewhere around negative 50. Brain and blood might be somewhere around positive 50, right? So fat, I know this does not look like a negative 50. I have no clue what that looks like. And brain and blood, that's a positive 50. I'm sorry. All right. So let's talk about how the heck are we gonna see all that stuff? We're gonna mess with what we call the window width and window level. Window width and window level. The window width assigns the quantity of pixel values to the grayscale. Window width is all of the pixel values that it assigns to the grayscale. So anything beyond that window width in the positive direction will show up as just pure whiteness, and anything below that window width in the negative direction is going to show up just black. This is powerful things to know here, because this will tell you everything you need to know when you're looking at a CT image in terms of attenuation. So I can I can change the window. Oh, and the other thing is the level. The level is that centered pixel value. Like what pixel value did I say center on that? Right? It looks like initially this window level's like at that 0 point of the Hounsfield scale, but I can change that, right? I could move my window level to the negative direction and say center on something like fat, right? The other thing I can do is I can change the window width, right? I can change. Yeah, we are. Yeah, we're going to look at this in a second. So I'm going to do it here on PAX.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I need to see how Vert is turned on this week. So walk me through that in a second. So if I change the level, I'm going to be changing on what I'm focused on. If I change the window width, I can change the contrast, the degree of contrast. I can change the degree of contrast. So if I have a really wide window width, I will see a whole lot of different shades of gray. If I have a really narrow window width, I'm going to be increasing my contrast. I don't want to bog down too much on contrast though, because frankly, contrast is one of the most confusing things that we could talk about in CT. Because sometimes we talk about iodine contrast, sometimes we talk about image contrast, and frankly, I think it's outside of the scope of this discussion to really drill down into contrast. Just know that it's a fairly complicated thing, and we will cover it in depth when we get into CT next trimester. I even get confused talking about contrast, in all honesty. There's one other thing that might be important to talk about in terms of thinking about these Hounsfield units and understanding these attenuation profiles, and we're going to call this an ROI, a region of interest. So we can define on a CT image, an area, we can circle it, and it can tell us what the attenuation value for that area is. It'll give it to us in Hounsfield units. And from that, knowing that, for example, if I told you that I sampled this right here and it was 50 Hounsfield units, what might that be?
Blood or brain.
Good. Or if I said I sampled this right here and it's like negative 800 Hounsfield units, what might it be?
Like lung tissue.
Good. Good. Yep. Okay, well here's our activity. I'm going to pull up PAX here on this workstation. I'm going to toggle some stuff out. And I'm going to let you actually see how to change window width and window level. We'll also look at how CT works with spatial dimensions. And we will, there's one other thing I kind of want to do with that. Oh, we'll set an ROI on an image and take a sample of an area. Okay, so give me just a second to set that up. Let's test ourselves a little bit about that, okay?
Seriously, about me?
I know. So we've just spent a lot of time, looking at these window widths and window level changes and stuff. This is the way it applies in the real world. So all I'm interested in, okay, is between these two images, which do you think the tech has changed? Have they changed, the window width or the window level?
The width,
Good. This is a window width change. Why do you say that?
because it's still got like it's more gray, so it's lighter than it is dark.
Good. Good. And the lungs are still black, right? The lungs are still black. The bones are still white, right? So it looks like we've just changed the window width. We've increased the shades of gray. All right, on this image, what have we done? Have we changed the window width or the window level? Someone other respond.
Is it the level? Because of the left one, it's sharper than the right, but they have the same amount of gray?
That's a really, really, really good way to think about it, but no. This is still a window width change. I think what might be throwing us off is we have an artifact on this image, right? This is one of the most common artifacts you will see. It is a beam hardening artifact because this patient has gold teeth or something, metal fillings in their mouth, right? So we've got these streaks on the image over here, right? Yes, this is their bling. And it's blinging out my image too. So what I've done was I've just increased the window width in order to decrease that contrast brought on by that artifact. But I liked your reasoning, yeah. Okay, last one. Is this a change in window width or window level?
Level.
Good, yeah, this is a window level change. So now I've told it so over here I'm probably got a negative level, and over here I probably have a positive level. Another thing that's interesting about this image, and I want to point out to us because this is very, very significant to us as radiation therapists, two things really. Number one, this patient's probably been shielded with a breast shield, right? So there's some kind of cadmium or some kind of breast shield put in place, and they do this quite a bit in diagnostic imaging now. They're trying to reduce surface dose, right? Particularly to areas like the breast. But they've also clipped the breast, right? What do I mean by that? We have a area of view, right? So we have a display field of view, we also have a scan field of view. And in this case, I can't tell which it is without looking more in depth at this image. But I have clipped, for example, the breast over on this side. Do you see how I've just kind of chopped off a portion of the breast? It bleeds beyond the borders of the scan, right? It's a big no-no for us as radiation therapists, right? Definitely don't want to clip the breast that you are trying to simulate, right? You may have to clip the breast of the opposing side, right? So this is a constant give and take for us when we're using all this technology for simulation, and this is just kind of a segue towards some of our activities as well as what we're doing next week. But now, knowing all that we know about CT, we're going to have to think about how it has both some great power, but it also has some limitations, right? It also has quite a few limitations for us as radiation therapists. And this is probably one of the number one limitations of CT. And it goes back to that gantry aperture size, right? The bigger my gantry aperture is, the more I can sample without clipping anatomy, right? But if I'm working with a fairly small gantry setup, or I'm using a patient setup that pushes the patient too far away from the scan's isocenter, I am going to run the risk of clipping anatomy, okay? Let's talk very, very briefly about artifacts, because you will probably start to see these on some of your CT images. And I apologize, Julie, I am going to zoom in on these a little bit.
Okay, I'm looking down.
Okay, look down. This one right here is what we will call a ring artifact, and it's typically caused by a malfunction in the machine or just a miscalculation. The machine needs to be calibrated, so we can see that ring shape. This is actually a water phantom. This is what we use to do this artifact check. Is every morning we should be doing some kind of CTQA where we put a water phantom on the machine and scan it. This is one of the things we're looking for. Here's another one that is very impactful to us in radiation therapy. You'll probably see this artifact quite a bit. We're going to call this an out-of-field artifact, right? This is an out-of-field artifact. These images are on the same patient at the exact same level. Can anyone guess what has changed between these pictures?
Was it something they were wearing?
Had to be.
That's close, but it's this. This versus this, right?
Wow.
This down here on I guess I'm getting confused, I'm thinking CT. But on our left, patient's arms are down. So the arms are hardening the beam and streaking my abdomen images. If I bring the patient's arms up, I don't have the arms in the way, so I won't have this artifact. The other thing that is integral to this is it's not just that the arms are hardening the beam, and I'll talk about what I mean by that in just a sec. It's also that they're outside of the scan field of view. Okay, so we might as well talk about this now, because I've alluded to it already. We have a scan field of view, and we have a display field of view. SFOV and DFOV, right? What do I mean by that? All right, we've got this CT scanner, and it has an aperture in it, right? Within this aperture, there's actually an area that's slightly smaller than the aperture size. That's the scan field of view. It can't scan all the way out to the edges of the CT scanner. It has an aperture, and then it has an area within that it can scan, and that's the scan field of view. If we had a patient, they move through that scan field of view, I've got all that data. But I don't have to display all that data, because I also have a display field of view. And say I only want to display this information right here, right? The significant thing about this, though, is that I could not make that display field of view bigger than the scan field of view, right? I can make it anything smaller than the scan field of view, but I cannot make it anything bigger than the scan field of view. Question?
So on the scan field of view, is that pretty preset on each machine that will work?
Yes.
It has a certain set, can't change it, scanning field of view. And
Yes.
we have control over the display part.
You do.
Okay.
There are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, yes.
Okay.
Okay, good questions. All right, let's come down here and look at this image. I kind of alluded to this when I talked about the arms. This is a beam hardening artifact. I think our textbook talks about beam hardening. So what happened? Well, I think about this being like the Klondike bar, right? Or like the polar bear eating the people inside of the igloo, right? It's crunchy on the outside, but soft and whatever on the inside, right? With the Klondike bar. Y'all, those ads are still around, right?
I don't know if
No.
I remember them
I
if
don't
they're
know.
not.
Okay.
Sorry.
The brain is the same way. The skull is like hard on the outside, and it's full of soft and gooey stuff on the inside, right? So when the CT samples that, it's hardening the beam. The skull is just only the really, really high energy X-rays are getting through the skull. And then when they hit that soft tissue, they don't know what the heck to do with it. And then they have more hard skull to go through. So especially at the base of the bone, we see, the base of the brain, I should say, the base of the skull, we see beam hardening artifact. We saw it earlier with the arms too, because the bones of the arm had hardened the beam. This is a windmill artifact, and if you see this, you're pretty much screwed. Like it's, no, I'm just kidding. It's perfectly normal. Most of the machines have presets in place to fix this, but it has to do with trying to sample quicker than you're scanning. That's all I'll leave it at. So if we had, like we're trying to do this, and really we should only be doing this, we might get that windmill artifact if we're out here. This last one I'll talk about is very, very subtle. I have almost a hard time seeing it, so I'm gonna zoom in even more. Fortunately, we've got these arrows here. It's called an edge gradient. And what's happened here, very interestingly, is we have air. We have a future fart right here. We'll talk about them a lot. So this is a future fart. We've also got contrast media, and we'll talk more about contrast media next week. But this is probably barium contrast or some kind of oral contrast agent that's sitting there in the stomach, right? And I've also got some contrast here, iodine contrast in the aorta, right? But as the beam went from air to contrast to liver, that confused it. It was like, okay, I don't know what I'm seeing. Is the fart in the liver now? Right? Or is the barium in the liver? It created a gradient. The gradient's just a fancy word for like, I don't know if any of y'all have daughters, but like those like Trapper Creeper type folders where there's like a unicorn on it or something, and there's like a rainbow of different things, like a rainbow of like red.
I had those when I was a kid.
right? That's a gradient. A gradient is just a shift from one level of red to another level of red. In this case, it's a shift from one level of white to another level of white, or a shift from one level of black to another level of black. So we can see that shift here. It started out black and got less black, started out white and got less white. That's the fancy word for that's a gradient.
Yeah, you can barely see that.
It's very hard to see,
Yeah.
but we call that an edge gradient. So here are some activities for us.